echo the words of the Honourable Geoffrey Davies, who in his oration at the Queensland Scientific Division's meeting last year implored the colleges to take greater responsibility for restoring the trust of patients in their practitioners. This was especially following the Patel affair. In the main, this is achievable via collegiate activity promoting professionalism. And I'm not going to say any more about professionalism other than it's a handyism, because it describes at the interpersonal level where health and care objects suddenly meet and interface. Colleges are publicly and privately aware of extraordinary details of their fellows' performances, but all too often they invoke this "there for the grace of God go I." It's a platitude, and I think it's probably from a misplaced sense of mateship rather than peerage. Nothing provokes the ire of the observer than to hear after the event that somebody knew something was up. It smacks of protectionism and nepotism. If a college accepts its translational role and takes the so-called axiomatic rules of bureaucracy and government and interprets them for the higher order meaning they bring, they have the capacity to bridge the gap. They can influence bureaucratic priorities and promote fit professionals. As an example, this alignment makes colleges capable of identifying peers at risk rather than having to wait or react to allegations of boundary transgressions identified by bureaucracies, where the standard is often quite a distance from where we might like it to be in ordinary operating terms. It's actually best that the peers take charge of the at-risk colleague, because where willing, they're much better placed to understand the local needs and vulnerabilities of the practitioner involved. Colleges do have a role in formulating axiomatic rules that inform the boundary of fitness of their fellows. In a nutshell, it's a keystone of professionalism. Who else but our peers truly has the necessary breadth and depth of insight to properly outline what constitutes the medical expert, and by extension, the manifestation of the fit professional? Unfortunately, I must observe that too often this results in the approach reminiscent of our 20th century mathematicians. It's an erroneous attempt to describe a complete standard of operation for the fit professional. We've got Gödel to thank in another discipline for dispelling that myth. No college has an umpire present in every room and every clinical encounter, but figuratively speaking, they're just outside the door. Being closer to the granularity of everyday practice, they exert tremendous and valuable influence. Here I'm reminded of Professor Jerry Hickson detailing work from the Vanderbilt Healthcare Group in the US, where they have an amazing performance management process for the thousands of practitioners under their network. Far from peers identified at risk becoming obstreperous and resistant to change, in the face of good data presented by their peers, most are compelled to improve their performance. And I trust there's other examples out there, and they've been alluded to today. Turning our minds to medical education, I've got to admit a special interest here, particularly its role in professionalism and the fit professional. In effect, and I'm glad to hear it reiterated in other ways today, any opportunity for colleagues to interface professionally is, in my mind, an opportunity for education. I am decidedly in favour of apprenticeship models of training, because when they're designed around dialogic learning, and that's there for you to digest as I speak, they're capable of powerful cultural and behavioural change. And I'd argue that a thoughtful mix of competency-based training and apprenticeship titrated across the developmental trajectory of our doctors is likely to generate the fittest professionals. But why? Medical education in an apprenticeship model and a relationship is, to all intents and purposes, just one degree of separation from that highest order activity in healthcare of the clinical encounter. This position potentiates its value immeasurably. The fullest sensual engagement of the learner is activated. The brain draws such enormous amounts of information from its representing of the external world, from the central processes. It's little wonder that as a learning medium, it's the most profound. Tied to that, and you'll see the image move, I've come to appreciate, with the little experience I have had working with patients and peers, I've only been out for nearly just on 10 years, learning is best achieved with what is known in other literature as self-referencing. This is subtly different from the concept of reflective learning, which is a catchphrase of modern medical curricula. Self-referencing is action-based, it's reflexivity, to use the other parlance, and it requires the presence of another generally with greater insight into the context of the practitioner and the system in which they work. The student begins to identify from the contextualising of the peer a sense of self in the fitness landscape, and it's analogous to our Cartesian model here. Initially, the trainee might start out with a two-dimensional sense of their position in space and time. But with time, we can develop, under these circumstances, a much deeper and more dynamic experience of where we sit in the fitness landscape. Ultimately, the outcome of this awareness-raising process ought to be a professional who is continuously undertaking a rigorous examination of their motives and a more exacting truthfulness across the spectrum of their professional activities. So Liam challenged us right at the beginning of today to think about all of the stuff we're talking about in the context of why I get up in the morning, or why any of us as clinicians might get up in the morning. And in my anecdotal experience with the few thousand doctors I've met over the last 6 years in the work that I've done, it's this. This is what gets a clinician out of bed in the morning, the clinical encounter. I've several times contended that the highest order meaning of action for the fit professional is located in the clinical encounter, Murrow's last 3 feet of communication. Indeed, I consider this space with reverence, and I can't hope to say anything vaguely useful about the fit professional without some words dedicated to this. It is the subtlest, most fragile and prone to chaos, where all the systemic levels around it and the distinctions between health and care blur. It's also a place of great strength, where all the bewildering and conflicting pieces of information, motivations, unconscious projections, fears, vulnerabilities, and resiliences of the patient and the doctor have their opportunity for resolution. In my view, and I declare myself a dilettante phenomenologist at heart, this highest order of meaning-making is precisely the reason our definition of health and care blurs, making them synonymous. It's not because we're lazy or thoughtless, it's because in our experiential world, our most intimate encounter with the symbols and meaning of health and care occur in this space, which we then clumsily put together under the rubric healthcare. In the clinical encounter, it's often been in the face of my science being its most futile, that a deep commitment beyond what I can do affected the greatest benefit for patients. In these encounters, I learned something of the strength and vulnerabilities of my own performance boundaries. So by necessity, I learned something about my fitness as a professional. And I don't believe I'm alone in that type of learning. In fact, a professor who reviewed my talk today commented that if we consider the clinical encounter in reference to evidence-based medicine, the fit professional can be called upon to dissent if necessary from the dogma of the evidence and use their intellect and experience to allow them to arrive at a conclusion which is right for the patient, but might be quite different from the inherited wisdom. This is an awesome responsibility, and it's part of the privilege of service in medicine, in my view. My performance in the clinical encounter is not usually consciously shaped by the laws and hospital policies around, say, open disclosure, but I'm sure it influences me. It's not because of the words written down in the Guide to Good Medical Practice that I act sensitively towards grieving relatives, but I know on reflection those words have shaped my formal learning environments. The careful consideration of resource allocation in the face of a gravely ill patient, which is demanded of me by the health bureaucracy, is not necessarily in the front of my mind, but it must be influencing decision making at some point. I hope you can see that the fit professional, by the very necessity of engaging on the fitness landscape of healthcare, must essentially, if by degrees, engage with all the agencies on that landscape. And the fittest professionals are, in my opinion, those who engage most consciously with the reality of this in the clinical encounter. And I've shown a performance boundary here because I don't really have one in medicine. You may all have them in your own local colleges, but I took this one from the United Nations Environment Programme. And what they do each year is they publish a set of diagrams which visually describe where we sit in relation to prescribed boundaries which form the concentric circles. And we can see, for example, here, it's nicely demonstrated, that in biodiversity, we're profoundly outside even the outer limits of what would be considered safe boundaries for our planet's sustainability. That must translate at some level into our healthcare environment. The most vulnerable actor on the fitness landscape is invariably the patient. The power of the fit professional is their capacity to transform that potential energy of the healthcare system into kinetic service of the patient. But in any energetic system, entropy abounds, and it's usually the most vulnerable part of the system that is most affected first. This is the second role of professionalism. When we enact health and care, we simultaneously must be conscious to defend the patient from the inevitable tendencies to disorder. We know from great research to date what many of the ingredients required are to achieve acceptable performance boundaries in our professionals. One of the continued impediments to achieving greater penetration of these ingredients is an overdetermined concept of health and care. The symbols and patterns of meaning are too blurred and inefficiently combined in a way that renders both less effective. If we disambiguate health and care, we might more accurately impute a fundamental scientific principle called downward causality. And I'll explain. If the world was presented to us purely at the level of the cellular biochemical, we'd develop very good ideas about mitochondria, proteins and enzymes. But we may never realise the organisation is taking part in a cellular structure as an organ, or that organ occurs in a lion versus a dove versus a human. We miss what's upwards. However, from the level of personness, as we have experienced as a species, we've had great success in moving in the other direction, which is the downward causal. Given that we can't clone fit professionals, we must use our downward causality powers to understand some of the generalisable rules that might shape the environment in ways that promote fitness in individuals. And here's the strength of bureaucracies and colleges, if they are capable of diligent interpretation. We can make inferences and analogies from the complexity of the individual clinical encounter over time to promote generalisations that influence lower order systems. And this nesting of complexity within complexity is not new in healthcare. And in fact, Professor James Reason and many others have shown its value and its necessity in our understanding when we think about risk and risk trajectories. What I'm challenging us to strive for is a far clunkier, brain clunkier kind of engagement between all the actors at play on our healthcare landscape. If we don't have experiential aha moments on a regular basis, we can be sure that in the last 3 feet of communication, that concentrated moment where all the layers condense, the ultimate outcome criterion of the medical expertise, improved patient care, might be missed. It's not a call for perfection, as Leonard Cohen notes, but also as Winnicott in my own tradition has noted, good enough medicine is good enough. The fit professional is consummate in their understanding of regulations, protocols and procedures from bureaucracies and other organisations, but it's not dogmatic. The fit professional understands the role of peers, medical education and public institutions in defining the fitness landscape of their practice, but never forgets the primacy of the clinical encounter. They create for themselves the capacity to respond adaptively to change in their environment, avoiding the cardinal sign of nearly all psychological maladies, rigidity. They cultivate self-referential patterns of behaviour and relationships that allow them to identify early any threats to their performance boundaries when there's still time for compensation and restorative action. We're not enslaved to our axioms, but we allow them to filter into the clinical encounter thoughtfully, consciously, and rigorously. Health and care are not synonymous, but intuitively, and I do go as far as to say manifestly, they are intimately related. In the end, it is about the actors engaged in the clinical encounter doing their best to build a common meaning from which a shared set of goals might be arrived at. And the doctor in this encounter is the interpreter of health and its experience in the care relationship. I'm drawn to conclude that the joy and privilege I've discovered in my work so far is being responsible for bringing both health and care to my patients. Sometimes it's a little bit more of one than the other. This may be as a result of the dynamics of the relationship I'm in, or because of the pressures exerted from me from the external environment. I can say that I was once an angry trainee, railing against the system being the reason I found so little time to care for my patients. Over the years, I've realised that in the working environment, there are cracks in time and space where care can take even the smallest root. Reflection and self-referential learning allows me to cultivate those fragile shoots, such that most of the time, and we've got to remember, we're not all perfect, at the moment where care seems at most hopeless, in the face of the tasks demanded by my science, I take a breath or two and manage to find the cracks.